Welcome to the Small Business Success Tips Podcast with me, your host, Neil McDonnell. I've dedicated myself to your success in federal government contracting and host these podcast episodes as a way to provide key information and tips that'll help small businesses like yours learn how to more effectively sell your services to the federal buyer. Government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process. In each episode, our guest shares their knowledge and experience with you, helping you learn a bit more about the process. While they'll have different titles, their common goal is to help the federal government benefit from what small businesses offer. Each guest donates their time because they realize not everyone has the budget or time to meet them in person, and we absolutely thank them for that. Our guest today is Josh Frank, the Managing Director of RSM Federal. He's an author, trainer, and management consultant specializing in the government market with more than 30 years of experience helping businesses like yours succeed. Josh is a recognized authority on government sales and speaks nationally on small business strategy and business acceleration. But I got to tell you, the reason he's on the show is that I just couldn't put down his book, An Insider's Guide to Winning Government Contracts, Real-World Strategies, Lessons, and Recommendations. Every single chapter had awesome advice, and even for me, a person with over 30 years in this market, I was mesmerized by his suggestions and guidance, including the rationale for each of these recommendations. Frankly, I've looked at a ton of government contracting books, and this book is my number one recommendation for GovCon books out there, so definitely check it out. I'm excited to bring Josh to you today. Absolutely recommend that you follow up with him and his company afterwards. So welcome, Josh, and thank you for joining us today. As you know, I like starting each episode off with the same question to help listeners know a bit more about you. From a very high level, what do you do and what do you like best about what you do?
Hey, Neil. Thanks for having me on the show. It's great being here. And so in terms of what I do, as you indicated, I run RSM Federal, and we specialize in tactics, strategies for winning government contracts. And I personally specialize in tactics and strategies within the federal space. And my team and I, we've worked with companies on how to properly position your products and services. We run a program called Federal Access Knowledge Base with all templates and strategies. But if I had to sum up, I would say this. You can attend a dozen webinars. You can go to half a dozen conferences. You can get training from one of several dozen small business organizations and still not win contracts. And so what my team and I do is we advise and coach on how to apply the right strategies at the right time with the right tools to win contracts. And we've got about $2 billion in success with the companies we work with. And in terms of what I like to do, Neil, and you and I have spoken quite a few times. I'm an advisor, I'm a coach, I'm a teacher. And so my passion is helping small businesses succeed.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, and a very similar passion to me. I just letting the people who are listening know the way I do podcast interviews depends on what people are doing. And for Josh, there's all sorts of things I could have talked to him about, but the thing I wanted to bring to your attention as listeners, most importantly, is the book. And it's in particular because I really got so much value out of this. And the only reason I bought it was for me to evaluate it. But as I was reading it, it occurred to me how successful I could have been over the past 20 years if I had either had this book then, or more importantly, had worked with Josh over the last 10, 20 years that I was doing this. And so at the very least, if I can't help my previous self, I can help you moving forward, each of you. So I wanted to talk with Josh a little bit. And Josh, as we talked about, going through, before I get into some of the meat of the book, what inspired you to write the book? Because that's a big effort.
Yeah, I've been telling myself I would write that book probably for the last 10 years. And I've just never gotten around to it. And what I'll say to others that, maybe thinking about writing, there is no good time. There's no right time. It just took me forever. But what I found was there's no, Neil, I approach the market in a little bit of a different manner. And if you know, for some of your listeners have probably seen me at various conferences, given seminars, I approach the market in a different way. From a strategic perspective, in terms of how you communicate your value. And there are actually some things where I disagree with various folks. And so the reason I wrote the book was because there's, well, only one of me. And I'm saturated in terms of work. And I was like, for all those companies that are totally brand new to the market, that may or may not be able to afford help, can I give them for, you know, a couple of bucks what they need to truly understand the market? And so that's really the core reason why I wrote the book.
No, that's awesome. And I really am not trying to make this a plug podcast because that's not what I do. But this one, I swear, it's the price of a cup of coffee and a breakfast. It really is so worthwhile on Amazon. You can find that. So let's dig into it, Josh, because I really want to go into some of the.
Okay.
He has like, 5,000 chapters or something.
It's
he's
not
he's
that
got really
many
good stuff. Not
chapters.
5,000, but a good amount. But I just grabbed 4 that I thought might be related and into this podcast that could fit together and it would be valuable to the listener. But government sales is a long game. Is how I was looking at chapter 1. And this is something I think a lot of people who get into federal government contracting don't quite understand. And so can you expand a little bit on what do you mean by it being a long game?
Yeah. So now it's, you know, when it comes to government, it's about expectations. It's actually market agnostic. It doesn't matter whether it's commercial, you know, residential, corporate, government, state and local, it doesn't matter. You've got to have accurate expectations. And there are so many companies that they're either, you know, poor on cash flow, right? They're low on cash flow. And they say, you know what, I'm going to, the corporate market, commercial market is down a little bit. I'm going to get into government. I'll, you know, give it 6 months. And, you know, what I tell folks, the average company that's successful, you're looking at about 18 months, right? But if you think you're going to just start, unless you're commodity based, right? Unless you're product, which, and I've, you know, you can do that easily in weeks or months. But from a service perspective, right? Labor categories, labor rates, et cetera, at minimum is a year. You've got a position in the market. So government sales, what I often tell companies is, one, you really shouldn't be thinking about government sales until you have a commercial revenue stream, right? Whatever that may be. You know, number 2, it's strategic, right? It's not tactical. You can't look at government sales from a tactical revenue perspective until you're about a year in. And so in my book, success in the federal market, right? Whether we're talking the federal agencies or the Department of Defense, comes down to 4 things. 1 is understanding the market. 2 is perseverance, right? I mean, you got to have perseverance if you're going to be going, you know, a year plus cash flow without possibly winning. Not to say you can't win inside a year. I'm talking averages. You have to have, so understand the market, educate yourself. You got to persevere. You got to have a strong business strategy, and it's going to take time. And so, you know, this is one of the common things that I talk about. You know, what I tell folks is, look, 50% of GSA schedule holders, and for those that don't know what a GSA schedule is, it's simply a contract vehicle. That's all it is. But it's the most popular, most well-known. And 50% of them, they actually fail to win contracts. And so, you know, and I think you'll chuckle with me, you know, as soon as you register in the system for award management, you get absolutely hammered with emails, right?
Yeah.
From these other consultants, and some are good, some are con artists. That's another day, another story. But they say, hey, the government buys billions of dollars of what you sell. You have to have a schedule, and that's not true. Okay, that's not true. And so, people say, well, okay, I still want to win contracts. And I say to them, look, 50% schedule holders don't win. And then the other part of that is, and I want your listeners to think about this. Imagine you have two identical companies, okay? And the owners are the exact same education level. They are high school graduates, or they have bachelor's or master's or PhDs. The owners go to the exact same webinars online. They buy the same books on Amazon. They go to the same conferences. They have the same consultants if necessary. And one of them wins $3.5 million in the first 2 years. And the other company doesn't win a penny. Neil, explain that to me. Explain to me how two companies can have the exact same training, right? Which, all the training you see in the market, all the small business offices, PTACs, VBOX, EDCs, it goes on and on. One succeeds and one fails. A part of government sales being a long game is understanding you have to apply what you've learned. You can't just educate yourself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's good that you brought up the GSA schedule, because that's part of what I try to teach people out there, and a lot of us talk about it. Another way of describing it is it's just a license to hunt. It doesn't mean that there's anything out there, any fish in the water or deer in the forest. But
Yep.
you can go out there now legally. And I was just talking with somebody today about that same challenge that's out there. It's interesting. I just want to pick one thread before I move on from that topic of the long game.
Sure.
You were talking about the difference between like services and commodity. Why is it that a company that's focused more on the product side can see success back faster, and the people on the service side might take longer?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, if you're, for the most part, right, if you're service based, it's going to be FedBiz Ops, GSA eBuy, NECO for the Navy. Some of those horrible, awful reverse auction systems that are out there, no names provided. Those, when it comes to services, that's a long cycle, right? And in fact, I often tell people, hey, commercially it's 7 to 10 touches, to get a contract. Government, it can be up to 20, right? So, it takes twice the effort minimum on the government side. So services, that you've got a position for it. There's no quick buy unless you are doing some sort of environmental remediation study, or it's something that's under the micro purchase of, under $10,000. Yeah, they can get a service, a small paying service. But product, the commodity side, which is, you find it on FBO, you can find some on eBay. If you sell a product, whether it's, and it can be GSA Advantage, obviously, for schedule holders, but whether it is power tools, whether it's nuts and bolts, whether it's water heaters, plumbing, the list goes on, right? Government's Fortune 1, that would be DLA's Internet Bid Board System, or DIBS, DIBBS, right? Well, all you have to have for DIBS, all you have to have for DIBS is be registered in System for Award Management, i.e. you have your DUNS number, soon to be SAMI number. You go into DIBS, you create an account, and you can immediately start bidding. And as long as your price is the lowest, you'll win. But let me, and Neil, as you know, and a lot of others know, I go off on tangents. I can't tell you how many people, though, have lost their pants bidding on dibs without understanding what the packing and shipping needs to be. So for your
Yeah.
listeners, right? So for your listeners that sell product, before you bid on dibs, you really do need to talk to somebody, making sure you're packing and shipping correctly.
Yeah, and you and I both communicate a lot out there. One of the things I say to people is I don't think you should do prime contracting until you've done $5 million in subcontracting revenue. And I use that as just a number, but the point is not that you couldn't sell me something as a government buyer, for example, but because of the amount of lessons you learned, not just on how to sell to the government, but how to get paid by the government, how to find out that your products are stuck on the loading dock or whatever. So that's perfect, though. That's exactly what I was trying to do, Josh, is just help people understand that there sometimes is a difference between the sales cycle for service and product. And the last thing I would add to that is that the service side, the risk to the government is so much higher because it's unknown whether they'll get what they want from you. But if they're buying, if they're buying bolts, when they get the bolts, they pay you. So it's all done. The risk is all gone, basically.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that's why they'll allow you to prime there. Let's move on to another great chapter that you had in here that I've always been fascinated about, and people who have heard you talk anywhere around town, whether it's conferences or been at one of your events, they've heard you use a phrase called ghosting requirements and influencing the acquisition. And I love the very idea of influencing the acquisition. That just basically is marketing to me. But can you expand on that and what you mean by that?
Sure. So you picked probably one of my favorite chapters. So for your listeners, let's first level set for a minute before we go any further. To understand how you influence an acquisition, or in other words, positioning with the prospect so that you're more competitive than other companies, right? We have to understand the difference between acquisition and pre-acquisition. Okay. It's not complicated, but if all you're doing is reviewing emails from your bid matching tool, right? Whether it's PTAC, whether it's, GovWin, Bloomberg, or 1,000 other of those systems out there. And I will go on record right now saying you do not need an expensive one to start off. You should go to your PTAC. That's probably a good start. But if that's all you're doing, and if all you're doing is responding to RFPs and RFQs, requests for proposals or requests for quotes, your focus is the acquisition phase. Okay? So this is where 80% of all companies focus. This is why companies fail to win contracts, right? Because 80% of their time is focused after the acquisitions are on the street and proposals are due. Neil, when I give seminars at national events and I focus on pre-acquisition, and this is where you focus on, military agencies and military commands instead of opportunities. Where do we focus, right? We focus on building relationships. And just as important, we focus on collecting information and intelligence. So to put this in perspective, successful small businesses have both tactical and strategic activities, right? FBO, GSA, eBuy, DIBS, all these systems we've been talking about, those are tactical, right? You may win some contracts, but not consistently, right? And after you've validated your propensity, who buys what you sell, how much do they buy, how often do they buy it, you probably have 3 annual targets. And over the next year, you're going to attend events, you're going to make calls, you're going to build relationships, right? Both government decision makers and teaming partners. And that's the strategic side. So that's all just to level set to say, FBO and bidding on RFPs, that's tactical. There's little to no ability for you to influence and make yourself more competitive. Positioning before, right? Positioning in the market before the RFP hits the street, that is strategic. That is where successful small businesses influence acquisitions and win contracts. So let me drill this point home. 80% of companies, right, focus tactically on responding to RFPs. But to be consistently successful, 80% of the time should be focused on collecting intel and talking to government decision makers. Neil, would it help if I gave a definition of ghosting?
Yeah, I was going to ask you to do that, especially as it related to people's strengths, maybe. But before you even get to that, I just want to use an example for people. So if they're newer to maybe these phases of acquisition, just from my perspective, if you think about the likelihood of you winning, if you go to an award, your likelihood is 100% that you will not. So you have zero chance of winning when you go to award because they've already picked a winner. If you go to what Josh is talking about with the acquisition or the RFP phase, your likelihood of winning is, let's say, I don't know, 10% or something, just for easy numbers. But your likelihood of winning, the farther back away from the award you go, increases massively. And I think this goes into a little bit of what you might describe on ghosting too.
Yeah, yeah, and no, that's well said. I would also emphasize, the further back from award, right? As you put it, the furthest back from award you can get is talking to somebody in the government. Maybe it's a program manager, maybe it's some champion that says to you, Neil, what your company does, that's great. In fact, in about 8 months, we're going to be doing an acquisition for these type of services. Bam, that goes in your pipeline. And for the next 8 months, you're going to be collecting information and intelligence. So yeah, you're right. Instead of it being 10%, now when you submit your proposal, you may have, if you ghosted correctly, you may have 80% chance plus of winning.
No, that's perfect. And actually, this goes into the next topic I want to chat with you about in a minute about teaming. But as I look at this, it's both of us look at this. I talk about your company progress in 3 levels basically. First, you need to feed yourself. Then you need to have some people to feed you, and then you need to grow your company. And what I mean by that is, if you start a new company, generally it's you the owner, and you, in my opinion, you should be 1099ing somewhere and get a subcontract opportunity with a very small company. And it gets you in the door of government contracting. You start learning, but you're still just being the subject matter expert. And then you hire 4 to 10 people whose profit will pay for your salary so you can begin to grow the company. And the idea of some of the strategic stuff we're talking about certainly is not in the first phase. So if you're not making any revenue, you want to back up, and maybe this next topic we're about to talk about feeds right into it. That strategic long-term thinking, it's hard to think that way when you're worried about your mortgage. And so from my perspective, pay yourself first. And Josh, maybe that leads us into chapter 20, which really excited me. From your standpoint, I call it failure to team, failure to win. In fact, I'm sorry, you call it failure to team, failure to win. I just
Sure.
repeat it. But tell me about that. I mean, especially that failure to win if you're not teaming up with others.
Okay, so you picked another good chapter. So
Josh, I picked all the ones that if I had this book 3 years ago, I would have been like, oh, that makes sense. Let me go do that. That makes sense. Yes, I picked
awesome.
my favorites.
You're awesome. Okay, so let's start with some general facts. We already touched on one. More than half of companies with GSA schedules fail to win a contract. And by the way, that's not because they don't have good products and services. It's because they don't understand how to enter in the market, et cetera. Another fact, more than half of all certified 8A firms fail to win a contract. Those are minority, socially disadvantaged. And now a fact that speaks to your question, 90% of companies that successfully enter the government market win their first 3 or 4 contracts as a subcontractor, not a prime. Okay. When people ask me, and I mentioned it in the book as well, but they say, what are the advantages of teaming? I don't want to team. I don't want to have to deal with other companies. A lot of companies have had some bad experiences commercially or federally. And they go, it's just too much risk and it's too much trouble. And I say to them, then you don't understand for most of these companies, you don't understand the value that you're giving up. When I work with folks, I outline three sales models. You've already touched on them. Okay. Your three phases. I'm just going to say them in a different way.
Yeah.
You've got direct, which is prime. You have indirect, which is sub. And you have a hybrid sales approach, which is prime and sub. And most successful small businesses start with an indirect approach. You inferred that earlier. And they subcontract to generate revenue and to obtain past performance, right? I mean, that's the easiest way of getting past performance. But to accelerate into the market, you need a hybrid approach where you're both priming and subbing. Many companies won't start priming until the second year or third year. Some companies will start priming right out of the gate, right? But when you have a strong teaming strategy, you increase the number of qualified opportunities in your pipeline by more than 400%. And folks look at me, especially when I'm at a national conference, the eyes get real big and they're like, well, how the heck does that happen? Because your teaming partners are finding opportunities and putting you on their team. And so another couple things that popped to mind. Another advantage is who writes the proposal, the prime. So when you're first starting out in government, if you want to learn how to write a government proposal, team with a company that knows. And if I keep going further down this rabbit hole, if you look at your pipeline, and Neil, let's say you've got 18 opportunities, 10 you plan to prime and you're moving them through your pipeline. The other 8, you don't write those proposals. This is why a formal, strong teaming strategy is a force multiplier. It helps you generate revenue while protecting your time, your resources, and your money.
Yeah, no, it's funny. We're the choir. So we're talking to the choir because I listen to you and I'm like, and this is something I'm very passionate about. Is like, I can't help the people who don't want to hear this message, but there's so many people who would benefit if they just heard the message, which I really appreciate you being on the podcast as a guest and what I'm doing. You know, the more you and I can, and others like us can share this message out there, because you're totally right. I love that approach of indirect being basically all subbing, and then the hybrid, and then the direct being the priming, because that articulates what I've been trying to do. In fact, you'll see me, you know, for the first 20 times or so, Josh, I'll give you credit. I say, hey, I borrowed that. And then I'll say it was my joke or something. But the idea of how do you move forward? I'm not telling you can't prime. I'm telling you can win by teaming and learn and grow. And that's so perfect. Actually, I'd be curious on your thoughts on this, because I advise people that when you come into this space, you want to be able to write a really good paragraph about what you do. So find a teaming partner and say, I can write a paragraph. And then as you mature, you can write a page. And as you mature, you can write a section. And at some point, you might be able to write the whole proposal, but that prime is still kind of being the one who then mushes it up a little bit and submits it as their being the lead. Mm-hmm. But I try to tell people, you don't have to write the whole thing. You just have to get good at your part. Is that some advice that you pass out there, or do you have different ways of saying something similar?
No, I think how you just described it it was very strong. It was valid. You know, I don't think I have a better way. I just have a different way. I simply tell companies, as you know, whether it's one section or all, the more you subcontract, the more you'll be involved with proposal teams, the more you'll be involved with what's called the red team. I'm not going to go through all the different colors, but you know, there's various, you know, green team, blue team, red team. Bottom line, it's just groups of people from different companies getting together and writing a proposal. The one thing that I think we should add, though, to this topic, to this discussion, is just because you are subbing doesn't mean you're going to be given access to the entire prime's proposal. And so there are a couple tactics that I normally teach. One of them is, you know, tell the prime, hey, listen, I want to be involved in red team. right? I think that my feedback can help the team be more competitive. And so I'd like to be there to review the whole thing, not just my part, so I can help integrate and communicate value. Otherwise, most primes don't show the full proposal. The only part you see is yours. So I just wanted to throw that in.
No, that's really good because that goes with something I preach all the time about givers gain. And so if you give of your time to participate and contribute to the red team activity, which is basically one of the final teams looking at the proposal, then the gain is you get to see the whole proposal potentially.
That's
And
right.
and even large, I mean, I encourage people constantly just team with smalls, unless the
Mhm.
larges are knocking on your door. But even larges, I've had experience where they'll end up showing us the whole proposal because we're the subject matter experts on a particular opportunity. And that's what I try to encourage people out there to do as well. So we get about 5 minutes left as we're wrapping up. And I wanted to just get, just from your perspective, as you, if I come away from the book for a second, I go to RSM Federal because your company's focus is helping businesses succeed in the government space. If you had a lesson learned, and I know I'm throwing this one out of left field for you, but if you had a lesson learned on what you would like to see small businesses do to be more prepared to take advantage of folks like you, right? If they walked into your door, what could they do to get to the level where then you can take them to the next level?
Good question. Good question. First
Like,
and foremost,
yeah.
and I have no Yes, I speak. I train PTAC counselors every couple years at their national event, but I have no formal direct relationship with PTACs. But that being said, if you're completely brand new to the market, you do need to go to the PTAC. Okay, I mean they'll help you with all those pieces. Um, but I would say the number one thing is don't simply take everything for at face value. One of the challenges, Neil, that a lot of companies are going to have is they're going to have data overload. Too many people, they're going to talk, anybody new to the market is going to talk to like 10, 15 different folks and organizations and nonprofits. Everybody has an opinion, right? Everybody has their 2 cents. And most small businesses, you just accept it, okay? Just accept that it's going to happen to you. Most small businesses start scratching their head going, I don't know what to do now. All right, everybody's saying something different. I mean, it's sort of the same, but it's not. What I would say to you is you don't just think government sales. Okay. If all you do is what everyone tells you to do without taking basic business common sense into account, you're going to be doing what everyone else does. And what everyone else does is pretty much fail. So you need to combine business development on the government side with business strategy. And so as long as you understand that, as long as you understand, like, for me, I tell people, you don't win contracts because of your socioeconomic status. I don't care if it's an 8A sole source. You do not win a contract because you're 8A or veteran owned or woman owned, right? You don't. So, capability statements, I'm going a little longer here, bear with me. I highly recommend against taking capability statements to meetings with your prospect. And why? Because you can tailor it afterwards. And that's a whole nother, podcast. But so the short answer, Neil, is don't take everything at face value. Think, use your gut, and combine business development with business strategy. And if you think that way, then you'll be ready for the advanced type of capability and et cetera that I provide.
That's awesome. And just because I'm a huge fan, and I've been saying this, but Josh just dropped a tip, right? And he said, do not take your capability statement to the meeting. That's chapter 5 in An Insider's Guide to Winning Government Contracts, Real World Strategies, Lessons, and Recommendations. If you listen to my podcast, and I've got, I don't know, 30 or maybe a little more, never do I plug anything. And so I want you to understand why I'm doing that. I don't I like you, Josh, but I don't care about Josh. Like, they don't care about our tags, and I don't care about Josh will benefit from this. I say this is a great book, but my point is chapter 5. When I read that, Josh, and I don't want us to keep going too much farther, but when I read that, that was a tip. I went, oh my God, that made me go to chapter 6 and chapter 7 and just keep reading, because that is
Thanks.
such a great tip on marketing, like how to touch somebody. Marketing touching, for the listeners out there, it's this idea of continuing to touch people in a way that they feel like they're getting value from the communication. And this was just something that was such a great tip. Now you'll have to read the chapter to learn more about
That's right.
that. But no, that was perfect. So, okay. So thanks, Josh. I know I speak for our listeners when I say thank you for joining us today and sharing your knowledge. We'll have your contact information, obviously a link to the book where people can get that, and some of the information you shared today in the show notes. But can you let our listeners know how they can reach you or your company if they want to learn more?
Yeah, sure. So 3 things. One, LinkedIn. I'm a prolific LinkedIn user. I put a lot of stuff out. Just search for me, Joshua Frank, under RSM. Number 2, you can send an email to contact@rsmfederal.com, or just go to our website, and we've got a contact us page, and that's at rsmfederal.com.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. Appreciate it. And as we wrap up this episode, I wanted to remind all of you listening of a few things. First, if you find this information valuable and think others would, please share a note about us on LinkedIn or one of the other social media platforms. Definitely give us a thumbs up where you can on the podcasting platforms, on LinkedIn, etc. And then second, click the subscribe button on the podcast if you're listening to it on one of the platforms, to make sure that you're notified when we have new episodes that are released. I'm your host, Neil McDonnell. I thank you for listening to this episode and hope you'll join us again for other episodes. Remember, government contracting is not a secret. It's just a process.